In this video, I'll cover NASA's pivot on commercial space stations. NASA calls them Commercial LEO Destinations, or CLDs for short. I will refer to them as space stations, as that's a common term everyone understands. We'll cover the position of NASA and the commercial vendors, which now show a clear division. After that, we'll discuss the investor's dilemma. Do they believe the vendors or NASA? And then, finally, my opinion. After this video, drop your opinion and thoughts in the comments section and we'll discuss on the live stream this weekend. I do a live stream every weekend, recapping my videos with images and clips. I read out the best comments and answer chat messages. Hope to see you there for the next one. One note for the purposes of this video, I consider 3 credible vendors for commercial space stations. They are Vast Space, Axiom Space, and Starlab. Orbital Reef by Blue Origin is on the back burner, considering the amount of higher priority work Blue Origin has, and that's before their failed New Glenn launch, which put an AST payload into the wrong orbit. Okay, let's first discuss NASA's new position on commercial space stations based on what was announced at the NASA Ignition event recently. NASA's position. First of all, NASA's old position was that they would fund multiple commercial space stations to be used by NASA as a replacement for the soon-to-be deorbited ISS. These stations were expected to be largely self-funded by the private sector, with NASA being one of many customers, although NASA would be the anchor customer needed to close the business case. NASA has made it clear they don't want to fund only one provider so as to avoid a monopoly, which would likely lead to high prices for NASA astronauts. During the Ignition event, NASA stated, after an internal study, they don't believe the private sector can support space stations yet. In NASA's opinion, the hoped-for commercial demand for tourism, in-orbit manufacturing, research and commercialization of space hasn't happened. As a consequence, there isn't enough demand to make commercial space stations viable. NASA doesn't have sufficient funding to support even one, never mind multiple stations. This is why NASA came up with an alternative approach, which we'll cover in the next section. First, let's look at the number of privately financed missions to space to better understand NASA's position. PAMs, Private Astronaut Missions. Private astronaut missions, or PAMs as NASA calls them, are short-stay visits to the International Space Station. There have been 4 of these missions so far, all operated by Axiom Space, using the Crew Dragon from SpaceX to ferry the crew to and from the ISS. NASA is now diversifying with 3 future missions planned from Axiom, Vast Space, and Voyager, the developer of the Starlab station. Individuals and sometimes astronauts from other countries fly on these missions. NASA requires the commander to be a NASA-certified astronaut, which cuts the number of paying seats from 4 to 3, which is disastrous to companies trying to make a profit from these missions. Private free-flying missions are independent missions to space. They don't dock with the ISS. These missions are paid for by wealthy individuals. The 3 missions so far are Inspiration 4 in 2021, Polaris Dawn in 2024, and Fram 2 in 2025. No future missions of this type have been announced. And finally, National Space Agency missions. Astronauts from national space agencies such as ESA, the individual European nations, Canada or Japan, flying on commercial vehicles either to the ISS or for in-space missions. There have not been announcements of this kind of mission. Non-US astronauts do travel to the ISS from time to time, but those missions depend on barter arrangements where those countries provide hardware or funding in exchange for seats. ESA has expressed interest in commercial space stations, but without any commitment to long-duration flights. In ESA's post-ISS study, which is ongoing, 2 scenarios for future space station missions rely on commercial space stations. The third scenario is a European-led space station. If ESA goes that route, then that would result in even less demand for commercial space stations. Other nations such as Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and India have purchased short-duration seats on commercial missions. While there is some limited demand for training or prestige flights, it's not enough to sustain a station. This backs up NASA's position that there is not enough demand for flights to sustain commercial space stations. a total of 16 non-professional commercial astronauts to the ISS, with a further 12 on free-flying missions over the last years. It's worth noting that 2 of the free-flying missions were funded by Jared Isaacman. Given he is the current NASA administrator, he won't be funding any new missions for a while. In-space manufacturing or pharmaceuticals production is too small scale to support space stations. Smaller startups like Vada Space and SpaceForge provide spacecraft to perform small-scale manufacturing, which is still in the early phases of development. Now we understand the problem, let's look at NASA's solution. NASA's alternative approach. NASA's alternative approach is to add a new core module to the existing International Space Station. This module will have 2 docking ports that can be used to attach 2 commercial modules from different vendors. Let's go over NASA's plan in some detail. First, NASA procures a core module that will connect to the existing International Space Station. This module will provide propulsion, power and cooling, basic life support, and is compatible with existing transportation, which means Crew and Cargo Dragon. The core module attaches to the ISS forward port. Commercial modules would provide research and habitation capabilities. The vendor modules remain attached to the core module, waiting for the market to mature. Later on, these modules can be detached to become free-flying stations. In essence, the core module becomes a hub for future free-flying stations. ISS assets can be transferred to the core module before the ISS is deorbited. When a vendor detaches from the core module to become a free-flying station, that opens up a docking port for a new vendor. This way, NASA can foster new entrants by nurturing smaller vendors. Phase 1 of the new approach is between 2026 and 2029. A core module will be selected along with 2 initial commercial modules from separate providers. Phase 2, depending on demand, power and cooling will be added. Phase 3, also dependent on market demand, will add further commercial services and expansion. NASA is assuming a budget of $250 million per year through the end of ISS. The end state is multiple detached free-flying stations, with NASA one of many customers. This was their previous goal, only the means of achieving it has changed due to limited private sector demand and insufficient NASA funding. To help vendors, NASA will increase private astronaut missions to 2 per year, sell the commander's seat to private astronauts, and consider potential joint crews. That means 1 or more NASA astronauts may be included on private astronaut missions to fill the seats and get the missions flying sooner. Let's now look at the vendors' response to NASA's new approach. Commercial space station vendors' position. Vastspace CEO Max Hout said, "We believe we can be profitable on the current market, not waiting for the future market." Unquote. Jonathan Certain from Axiom said, "I'm not changing my plans. Whenever that CLD solicitation comes out, we're ready for it." Unquote. Common complaints about NASA's new approach are that they are moving the goalposts, shaking investor confidence and risking capital flight. The alternative approach forces design changes, as vendors must now dock with NASA's new core module, which likely won't exist until 2029 at the earliest. It makes it hard for vendors to secure new funding. If they continue with their current plans, they risk falling out of alignment with NASA and potentially losing future NASA missions. If they change their designs, they risk losing existing funding that was raised for an independent space station. How can vendors redesign their stations around a core module that doesn't even exist yet? Vendors would also need to change the altitude and inclination of their space stations. Starlab, for instance, was planning to orbit at 500 kilometers. Thermal management, power and cooling requirements all change since modules will be docked with the ISS, possibly with the station's giant solar panels obscuring sunlight to the vendors' modules. It's hard to see how this helps the vendors at all. Congress doesn't like the plan either. Lawmakers have said that NASA is not acting like a reliable partner. That reminds me of NASA's approach to its international partners, ESA, Canada and Japan, who have suffered due to NASA's unilateral decision-making. causing billions of dollars to be wasted. Members of Congress have said these repeated changes going back over 20 plus years have undermined trust in NASA, both within the private sector and internationally. Investors. Most investors want to see a commitment from NASA to flying missions to commercial space stations before they're willing to invest. That's reasonable. Without NASA-paid flights, it's hard to see how any of the vendors can be profitable. Unlike cargo and crew programs to the ISS, which NASA largely funded, space stations are expected to mostly fund themselves. This makes the role of private investors crucial. Although VAST, Starlab, and Axiom have all received hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, that funding was on the basis of future government contracts. If that is no longer the case, you have to wonder if investors will change their mind on their investments. With NASA now believing that space stations are not commercially viable, it undermines investors' confidence, making NASA's position of a lack of commercial viability a self-fulfilling prophecy. My opinion. I agree with NASA's position. We haven't seen enough demand to show that commercial space stations can be funded and operated by the private sector, at least without substantial subsidies from NASA, which isn't going to happen. NASA is clear. They're focused on the surface of the moon, the Artemis program, and the moon base. In addition, the US administration is looking to make large cuts to NASA's budget. So far, Congress has blocked those cuts, but it's hard to see how NASA's budget can adequately support multiple commercial space stations while returning to the moon. The reality is that NASA does not have the funding to support even one station. The demand from the private sector is far too small to support commercial space stations. It seems that when ISS is deorbited, that will also mark the end of NASA's only destination in low Earth orbit. Final thoughts. I don't like NASA's pivot, but I can't really see a viable alternative. My opinion is that space powers should own and operate space stations. The time isn't right to make them fully commercial. Hopefully that day will come. But in the meantime, space powers must pay for their upkeep. The US is fast heading towards a future where it loses its only outpost in low Earth orbit. The ISS will be deorbited in 6 years or less, with a core module a temporary stopgap solution that likely does more harm than good. Far better to spend money on a national space station, even if it's smaller than the ISS. Otherwise, China, followed by perhaps India, will be the only space station powers with an orbital outpost around Earth. This is why I have said ESA should commit itself to building and operating its own space station in low Earth orbit. Do you think space stations operated on a commercial basis are viable given the limited budgets from customers, either wealthy individuals or national space agencies? Can you think of a solution to the problem of operating habitable outposts in low Earth orbit for a reasonable cost? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this space video, consider buying me a coffee to help fund more episodes like this. The link is in the description. Watch the weekly live stream to see the images, clips, and slides from this week's videos. It's a live Q&A on this week's space topics where I read out loud some of the best comments. The more people join, the more fun the live stream is. Be sure to like and subscribe so you will see our upcoming videos. We make videos every week covering the space industry with an emphasis on the smaller space startups that aren't covered so well on other channels. See you soon.